March 6, 1944, 10:47 a.m. The radar station at Wittenberg hums with static electricity and tension. A German Luftwaffe controller leans over the glowing green scope, watching the blips multiply like a spreading disease across the screen. Coming from the west, high altitude, the pattern is familiar now. American heavy bombers, probably 200 or more, droning toward the heart of the Reich. He reaches for the telephone to alert the fighter squadrons. Standard procedure: the Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts will climb, intercept over Brandenburg, hit them before they reach Berlin. It has worked before, but then he pauses. There are smaller blips, dozens of them. Fast, moving, not bombers, fighters, that's not unusual. The Americans have brought P-47s before, short-range escorts that turn back at the German border, leaving the bombers naked for the kill. But these aren't turning back. They're still coming, past Magdeburg, past the Elbe, still coming. He recalculates the distance, checks again. His hand tightens on the receiver. These fighters are over Berlin. For the first time in the war, American single-engine fighters, sleek, silver, impossible, are escorting bombers all the way to the German capital. The Luftwaffe has prepared for many things, not this. To understand the shock of that March morning, you have to go back 18 months earlier, when the Americans believed they could win the air war without fighter escorts at all. In 1942, the United States Army Air Forces arrived in England with a doctrine carved in steel and confidence: daylight precision bombing, heavily armed B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, flying in tight defensive formations called combat boxes. The theory was elegant. Mutual overlapping fire would create a lethal sphere of protection. No fighter could penetrate it. The bombers would defend themselves. Strategic planners in Washington believed this so deeply they designed the entire bomber fleet around it. Long-range fighter escorts were considered unnecessary, even wasteful. Fighters lacked the range, the fuel capacity, the endurance. And besides, the bomber generals argued, the flying fortress didn't need a nursemaid. The British, who had already been bleeding over Germany for 2 years, tried to warn them. Night bombing was brutal but survivable. Daylight raids without escorts were suicide. The Luftwaffe was experienced, aggressive, and would tear apart any formation given the chance. The Americans didn't listen. The early raids in 1942 and early 1943 seemed to validate their confidence. Targets in occupied France, the Netherlands, shallow penetrations into Germany. Losses were manageable. The gunners claimed kills, dozens of them. Intelligence officers tallied the numbers and declared success, but those were the shallow missions. The Luftwaffe was probing, testing, learning. When the Americans pushed deeper into the Reich, everything changed. August 17, 1943, Schweinfurt and Regensburg. A double strike intended to cripple German ball-bearing production and aircraft manufacturing. 370, 6 bombers launched. No fighter escort beyond the German border. None existed with the range. The B-17s flew alone into Bavaria. The Luftwaffe came at them in waves. German fighters attacked head-on, a tactic the bombers weren't designed to defend against. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s dove through the formations, cannons hammering. Bomber after bomber fell, some exploding instantly, others spiraling down, trailing fire and men. Crews watched friends disintegrate in the sky beside them. 60 bombers didn't return, 60. Over 600 men dead, missing, or captured in a single day. The numbers were catastrophic, but the planners called it acceptable. The targets were hit. The mission succeeded. Losses could be replaced. They were wrong. October 14, 1943. Black Thursday, the second Schweinfurt raid. The air commanders needed to finish what they started in August. Destroy the ball-bearing plants, cripple German war production. 291 bombers went back. The Luftwaffe was waiting. German fighter controllers had refined their tactics. They knew exactly where the American escorts would turn back, at the border, when their fuel ran low. Beyond that line, the bombers were alone. Jagdschwader units scrambled from airfields across Germany, converging on the bomber stream like wolves on a wounded herd. The attacks began over Aachen and didn't stop until the bombers limped back over the channel. 300 German fighters swarmed the formations. Rockets fired from outside machine gun range. Cannons ripped through aluminum fuselages. Oxygen systems exploded. Men burned. 60 bombers lost, again. Another 600 men gone. But this time something broke. Not just metal and flesh. The entire strategic calculus. The 8th Air Force had lost 26% of its attacking force in a single mission. Replacement crews were arriving in England faster than they could be trained. Morale plummeted. Men calculated their odds and realized the math was fatal. Complete a tour of 25 missions over Germany. Statistically impossible. The daylight bombing offensive, the entire reason the Americans were in the European Air War, was failing. In November 1943, the 8th Air Force effectively halted deep penetration raids into Germany. They couldn't afford the losses. The bombers still flew, but to closer targets, safer targets. The Luftwaffe had won. Berlin remained untouched by American bombs. Göring had promised the German people it would stay that way. So far, he was right. But while the bombers stood down, a quiet revolution was happening on airfields across England and in design offices back in America. The problem was brutally simple. No Allied fighter could escort bombers deep into Germany and return. The Supermarine Spitfire, magnificent in a dogfight, had a combat radius of barely 175 miles. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, heavily armed and rugged, could push to 325 miles with internal fuel, enough to reach the German border, maybe just beyond, then turn back. Berlin sat 600 miles from English airfields. Fighter range wasn't just about fuel capacity. It was about weight, aerodynamics, engine efficiency, and mission profile. Climbing to 25 zeros, 0 feet burned fuel. Combat burned fuel, fighting your way home burned fuel. The mathematics were unforgiving, but there was another variable, one that could be changed. External drop tanks. The concept wasn't new. Auxiliary fuel tanks, jettisonable once empty, had been used experimentally before the war. But mass-producing them, making them reliable at high altitude, integrating them into combat doctrine, that required industrial commitment and tactical imagination. By late 1943, both were accelerating. The P-47 Thunderbolt began flying with 108-gallon belly tanks, extending its radius to 375 miles. Better, but not enough. Then 150-gallon tanks. The big Thunderbolt could now reach 425 miles, deep enough to cover bombers to the Rhine into western Germany, a significant improvement. But the real breakthrough was happening with a different aircraft entirely. The North American P-51 Mustang had begun the war as an orphan, a fighter designed for the British, powered by an Allison engine, fast at low altitude but wheezing above 15 0 feet where the bombers flew. The RAF used early Mustangs for ground attack and reconnaissance, promising airframe, wrong engine. Then someone had an idea. What if you took that sleek American airframe and married it to Britain's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that made the Spitfire legendary? The result was the P-51B, and it changed everything. The Merlin-powered Mustang was fast 440 mph at altitude, faster than anything the Luftwaffe had in production. It climbed well, handled beautifully, and most importantly, it sipped fuel with aerodynamic efficiency no other fighter could match. With internal fuel alone, it could reach 400 miles. With 275-gallon drop tanks, the P-51B could escort bombers 650 miles from base. Berlin was 600 miles away. The first P-51B groups arrived in England in November 1943, just as the bomber offensive was stalling. December brought more. Training intensified. Pilots learned fuel management, cruise speeds, formation tactics for long-range escort. The drop tanks were tested, refined, mass-produced. By February 1944, the 8th Air Force had enough long range fighters to try something that had been impossible 6 months earlier, a sustained campaign against Berlin itself. But the Germans didn't know this. Not yet. The Luftwaffe's defensive strategy had been built on certainty. German fighter units were positioned in a defensive belt stretching from France to Poland, a layered system where fighters could intercept, disengage, refuel, and intercept again as bomber formations penetrated deeper. The crucial advantage was time. American escorts would turn back, then the real killing could begin. Luftwaffe pilots were confident, even cocky. They had stopped the American daylight offensive. They had proven the bombers were vulnerable. Every pilot knew the rhythm of combat: wait for the escorts to leave, then attack. The Americans might have numbers, but the Germans owned geography. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had publicly assured the German people that enemy aircraft would never appear over Berlin. His Luftwaffe would stop them. The capital was protected. Berliners believed him. They had to. The British had bombed the city at night since 1940, but the Americans, with their daylight formations and their publicity about precision bombing, had never reached the capital. Not once. In early 1944, the German High Command knew the Americans were preparing something. Reconnaissance showed more fighters arriving in England. Intelligence reports mentioned new aircraft types. But the assumption held: fighters didn't have the range. Physics was on Germany's side. That assumption was about to shatter over Brandenburg in the cold March sky, and with it, the Luftwaffe's entire defensive paradigm would collapse. The Americans were coming to Berlin, and this time they weren't coming alone. Angle 1, the bomber crew's desperation inside the cramped fuselage of a B-17. The temperature at 25.0 feet hovers around 40 degrees below zero. Waist gunners scan the sky through plexiglass blisters, breath fogging their oxygen masks, fingers numb even through heated gloves. Every man knows the pattern. The P-47s will escort them to the German border, maybe a few miles beyond. Then they'll waggle their wings, good luck, and peel away, fuel gauges dropping toward reserve. After that, it's just the bombers and the Luftwaffe. The crews have learned to recognize the moment when they're alone. The radio chatter from the fighter escorts fades. The sky feels bigger, emptier. Then the call comes over the intercom: bandits 10 o'clock high. German fighters, black specks against white clouds, forming up for the attack run. What follows is controlled chaos. Cannon shells punch through aluminum skin like paper. Hydraulic fluid sprays. Men scream. The smell of cordite and fear fills the aircraft. Ball turret gunners track fighters through their gun sights, firing bursts, watching tracers arc away. Sometimes they hit something. Usually they don't. After Schweinfurt, after Black Thursday, bomber crews stopped talking about odds. They knew them too well. In some groups, the survival rate for a full 25 mission tour dropped below 25%. You could do the math on the back of a mission briefing map. Most men wouldn't make it. They flew anyway because orders were orders, because their friends were flying, because what else could they do? But they needed fighter cover all the way into Germany over the targets, back home. The P-47 pilots were doing their best, pushing their range, fighting magnificently within their limits. But limits were limits. Geography was geometry. When word spread in February 1944 that new fighters were arriving, Mustangs with the range to stay with them all the way to Berlin, something shifted in the ready rooms and barracks. Hope, cautious and desperate. Maybe they'd have a chance now. Maybe the sky wouldn't be a shooting gallery anymore. Maybe some of them would actually finish their tours and go home. They needed to believe it, because Berlin was coming, and everyone knew it would be the deepest, hardest target yet. Angle 2, the technical miracle of the Mustang, the P-51B, wasn't just incrementally better than other fighters. It was a paradigm shift, born from aerodynamic efficiency and engineering obsession. North American aviation designed the Mustang's laminar flow wing with a shape that reduced drag dramatically. Air moved smoothly over the surface rather than turbulent and energy-wasting. That efficiency translated directly into range. Where the P-47 burned fuel fighting drag, the Mustang glided through the air, its engine working less hard to maintain cruise speed. The Packard, built Merlin engine, license, manufactured from Rolls-Royce designs, gave the aircraft power where it mattered most. At 25,000 feet, where bombers flew and combat happened, the two-stage supercharged Merlin maintained performance that other engines couldn't match. The Mustang could cruise at 360 mph at altitude, fight at over 440 mph, and still have fuel to get home. Then came the drop tanks. Engineers designed 75-gallon and later 108-gallon disposable tanks that hung beneath the wings. Pilots would run these tanks dry first, then release them before entering combat. The aircraft instantly became lighter, more maneuverable, deadly. The tanks were cheap, made from pressed paper and glue or stamped metal, expendable by design. The British and American factories churned them out by the thousands. Fuel management became its own tactical art. Pilots learned to cruise at specific RPM settings, leaning the fuel mixture for maximum efficiency. They flew at optimal altitudes where the thin air meant less drag. They planned fuel stops, not literal stops, but mental checkpoints where they calculated reserves against distance to target and distance home. With full internal fuel and two 108-gallon drop tanks, a P-51B carried 489 gallons total. At cruise settings, that meant over 6 hours of flight time. 6 hours. Enough to fly from England to Berlin, escort bombers through their bomb run, engage German fighters, and return home with reserves. No other Allied fighter in service could match it. The Mustang didn't just extend escort range. It obliterated the limitations that had protected the Luftwaffe for 2 years. It turned a strategic impossibility into a tactical certainty, and it arrived in England in numbers large enough to matter just as the weather cleared for the spring offensive. The Germans had bet their defensive strategy on physics. The Mustang changed the physics. Angle 3. Luftwaffe confidence before the storm in February 1944. German fighter pilots still believed they were winning the air war over the Reich. Yes, the Americans kept coming. Yes, their formations were huge, their bombers tough. But the kill ratios favored the Luftwaffe, especially on deep penetration raids. German pilots knew they could hurt the bombers badly once the escorts turned back. They'd proven it at Schweinfurt at Regensburg dozens of times. The defensive belt strategy worked. Jagdschwader units stationed across Germany operated with tactical confidence born from experience. Pilots like Major Egon Mayer had perfected head on attacks against B-17 formations, diving in at closure speeds over 600 mph, firing cannon bursts into cockpits and engines, then breaking away before the gunners could track them. Riskier than tail attacks, but devastatingly effective. The FW-190A8s and Bf-109G6s were formidable aircraft, heavily armed, fast, flown by men who'd been fighting since 1940 and survived. They knew their machines, knew the tactics, knew the American patterns. When briefing officers pointed to maps showing incoming raids, pilots calculated fuel, ammunition, and intercept points with practiced efficiency. Berlin was special, though. Berlin meant defending the capital, the symbolic and literal heart of the Reich. Göring had made promises. Fighter units took those promises personally. Their honor was tied to keeping the Americans away. When the RAF bombed at night, that was one thing. British Lancasters in darkness were hard to stop. But American daylight bombers, visible, arrogant in their tight formations, those could be defeated, had to be. Nobody expected American single-engine fighters to appear over Berlin. It wasn't arrogance exactly, it was mathematics. The distance was too great. Every intelligence report confirmed it. The P-47s turned back at the border. The P-38 Lightnings had range, but were deployed in smaller numbers and had problems at high altitude. The Spitfire was purely defensive. When radar stations reported fighter blips penetrating past the Elbe in early March, Controllers assumed it was a radar glitch or a miscalculation. Fighters didn't come this far. They couldn't until they did. Angle 4, German radar controllers and the confusion the Freya and Wurzburg radar stations that ringed the Reich were manned by Luftwaffe personnel who'd learned to read the electronic signatures of air war with practiced precision. They could estimate altitude from signal strength, count formations by blip density, predict bomber streams' targets by tracking their bearing and speed. By early 1944, they'd seen thousands of raids. The patterns were predictable: large, slow-moving formations, heavy bombers, B-17s or B-24s, cruising at 180 mph, steady course, high altitude, smaller, faster contacts around them, escort fighters, P-47s mostly, sometimes P-38s, moving in weaving patterns above and beside the bomber boxes. The escorts would accompany the stream to a certain point. Controllers could calculate it almost to the minute based on distance from English airfields. Then the fighter blips would reverse course and disappear westward. After that, the controllers would vector Luftwaffe interceptors into the bomber stream. Clean, efficient, practiced coordination between radar, radio, and fighters. The system worked because it was predictable. American tactics were predictable. Physics was predictable. On March 4, 1944, the predictability shattered. Controllers at stations near Hanover tracked an incoming raid. Standard pattern at first. Heavy formations, high altitude, heading southeast. Fighter escorts present, everything normal, then the fighters didn't turn back. They passed the usual point, kept coming. Controllers rechecked their scopes, thinking equipment malfunction. They radioed other stations for confirmation. The fighter blips were still there, still advancing, past Braunschweig, past Magdeburg. At Wittenberg, a senior controller called Luftwaffe operations directly. We have single, engine fighter contacts maintaining course toward Berlin. Request confirmation. Are these our aircraft? A negative. All Luftwaffe fighters were accounted for, scrambling to intercept the bombers. Then what were these contacts? American fighters. Somehow, impossible, but there they were on the scopes, undeniable electronic facts. The controllers had no protocol for this, no tactical doctrine. They'd never needed one. They vectored German fighters toward the bomber formations as usual, but now the warnings they broadcast were different, uncertain. Heavy fighter escort accompanying target stream. Altitude 25,000 feet. Still present over Brandenburg. German pilots heard those calls and didn't believe them. Must be a mistake, miscommunication. Nobody flew single. Engine fighters 600 miles. Then they climbed through the clouds and saw the silver Mustangs with their own eyes, and the impossible became terrifyingly real. Angle 5. Göring's promises versus reality. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had built his reputation on the Luftwaffe's invincibility. In 1940, he'd promised his pilots would sweep the RAF from the skies over Britain. That failed, but the narrative shifted. Germany was defending now, and defense was succeeding. The Reich's borders were a fortress wall. Göring assured Hitler, assured the German people, no enemy bomber will reach Berlin. If they do, you can call me mayor. It was a boast, a propaganda tool, a challenge, and for years it held true, at least during daylight. The RAF came at night, destructive but imprecise. The Americans, despite their vaunted flying fortresses, had never sent their daylight raiders to Berlin. By early 1944, Göring's position was precarious. The Luftwaffe was stretched thin, bleeding pilots on the Eastern Front, struggling with fuel shortages, facing endless American production. But the mystique remained. Germany controlled its own airspace. The fighter arm was still capable. The bombers could still be stopped. Berlin was the line that couldn't be crossed. When intelligence reports in February suggested the Americans were preparing for Berlin raids, Göring reassured his commanders. Let them try. The distance was too great. Their fighters couldn't reach the capital. The bomber formations would be torn apart long before they dropped ordnance on the Reichstag. The Luftwaffe would prove, once again, that daylight bombing deep into Germany was suicide. He ordered fighter units concentrated. tactics refined, ammunition stockpiled. Everything was ready, except for the one variable nobody had properly accounted for, the Mustang's range. When the first reports came through on March 4, American fighters over Berlin, Göring reportedly refused to believe it, interrogated his staff, demanded verification. The fighter pilots weren't mistaken. The radar wasn't malfunctioning, single-engine fighters truly, yes, P-51 Mustangs, escorting bombers directly over the capital. The promises crumbled. The defensive strategy, predicated on geography and fuel mathematics, was obsolete overnight. Göring could blame his intelligence officers, his planners, the enemy's industrial capacity. But ultimately, the Luftwaffe had been outmaneuvered technologically and strategically. The one advantage they'd relied on, distance, no longer existed. For the fighter pilots facing those Mustangs in combat, Göring's promises meant nothing anymore. They were alone in the sky with an enemy who could now follow them anywhere, fight them over their own airfields, hunt them back to the ground. The psychological shift was seismic. The war in the air over Germany had fundamentally changed, and everyone knew it. Angle 6. Psychological warfare in Civil War is fought with weapons, but it's won or lost in the mind. The appearance of American fighters over Berlin wasn't just a tactical development. It was a psychological weapon more devastating than any bomb tonnage. For 2 years, German civilians had been told their Luftwaffe was protecting them. They'd endured British night raids, devastating but accepted as part of total war. But American daylight bombers had never penetrated to Berlin, and that absence was used as proof. The capital was safe, defended, untouchable during the day when people could see the bombers coming and feel helpless. When the air raid sirens wailed on March 4, Berliners went to their shelters expecting another British night raid or a false alarm. Instead, they heard the drone of hundreds of engines in broad daylight, massive formations of 4-engine bombers, and above them, the sharp, distinctive howl of single-engine fighters in combat. Silver Mustangs and Thunderbolts, American stars painted on their wings, dogfighting with German interceptors directly above the city center. Contrails traced frantic geometries across the blue sky. Aircraft fell, both German and American, trailing smoke into the streets and parks. For Berliners watching from windows and rooftops, the implications were immediate and crushing. If American fighters could reach Berlin, nowhere in Germany was safe. The war, which propaganda had kept psychologically distant, was now directly overhead, unavoidable, visible. For Luftwaffe pilots, the psychological impact was equally profound but different. They'd been the hunters, confident in their ability to strike bombers when vulnerable. Now they were being hunted themselves, engaged by aggressive, well-trained American pilots in aircraft that matched or exceeded their own in performance. German pilots began reporting encounters with silver fighters, with a mixture of respect and dread. The Mustangs were fast, maneuverable, and most disturbingly, they were everywhere. Above the bombers, beside them, below, weaving through formations, diving on German attackers before they could press home their runs. The Luftwaffe's tactical advantage had always included the ability to choose when and where to engage, hit the bombers when escorts left, break off when things got too hot, land, rearm, intercept again. Now that flexibility was gone, the Americans could chase them down, follow them to their airfields, engage them continuously throughout the entire mission. Morale, that intangible but critical factor, began to crack. Pilots whispered in ready rooms, if they can reach Berlin, what's next? Munich? Vienna? How do we stop something that never runs out of range? The answer, increasingly, was that they couldn't. And knowing that, flying into combat knowing you're outmatched, outranged, and outnumbered, erodes courage faster than any bullet, the Silver Mustangs weren't just fighters. They were symbols of inevitable defeat, visible proof that the war was lost in the sky, and everyone who saw them understood exactly what they meant. March 4, 1944, dawned cold and clear over England, the kind of weather bomber crews dreaded because it meant no reprieve, no stand. down, no postponement. Briefing rooms across East Anglia filled before sunrise. Officers pulled back curtains from wall maps, revealing red ribbons stretching from English airfields deep into Germany, terminating at a single word written in block letters, Berlin. The room went silent. Then someone whispered, "Jesus Christ." They'd known it was coming. Rumors had circulated for weeks. But seeing it made real, the line drawn across 600 miles of enemy territory, made throats tighten and hands shake as men reached for cigarettes. The target wasn't a specific factory or rail yard. It was the city itself, a psychological strike, a statement. The 8th Air Force intended to show the Germans that nowhere was beyond reach, not even the capital. And for the first time, American fighters would be there for the entire mission. Colonel Don Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group flying P-51 gave his pilots the briefing they'd been waiting months to hear. "We're going to Berlin. We're taking the bombers all the way in and all the way out. Stay with them, protect them. This is what we've been training for." At 10:15 a.m., over 730 heavy bombers lifted off from English airfields, B-17s and B-24s forming massive combat boxes, stacking altitude and position as they assembled over the channel. Around them, 644 fighters climbed into escort positions, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings and the new silver Mustangs. The P-47s and P-38s would cover the early legs. The Mustangs would go all the way. The Armada crossed the Dutch coast at 25,000 feet. The German radar net lit up immediately. Controllers scrambled fighters from bases across northwestern Germany, Jagdschwader 1, JG-3, JG-11, JG-26. Experienced pilots strapped into FW-190s and F-109s taxied out, took off into defensive formations. Standard procedure, they knew the drill. What they didn't know was that the drill had changed. The bomber stream pressed eastward, engines thundering, contrails painting white scars across the winter sky. The first German fighters made contact near Hanover, diving on the lead bomber formations, preparing to hit them hard once the escorts turned back. The P-47 Thunderbolts engaged, dogfights erupting at 28,000 feet, spiraling aircraft flashing wings, tracers arcing through freezing air. But the P-47s weren't alone. Mustangs stayed with the bombers, weaving in S-patterns above the formations, hunting for threats. When German fighters tried to position for attacks, silver P-51s dropped on them, forcing them into defensive breaks, scattering their attack runs before they could reach the bombers. The stream continued east, past Braunschweig, past Helmstedt, deep into Germany. The P-47s, fuel exhausted, waggled their wings and turned for home. The bombers tensed. This was always the moment, the abandonment, the beginning of the gauntlet. But they weren't abandoned. The Mustangs remained, dozens of them, sleek and fast, holding position. Bomber crews saw them and felt something they hadn't felt in months over Germany, protected. Major James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group, flying a P-51 broke from formation when he spotted over 30 German fighters assembling for a mass attack on a bomber group near Brunswick. Alone, he dove into them. For 30 minutes, Howard engaged wave after wave of enemy fighters, shooting down at least 4, damaging several more, disrupting their entire attack formation through sheer aggression. His Mustang absorbed hits, leaked fuel, but stayed airborne. He saved an entire bomber group through individual audacity. He would later receive the Medal of Honor. The bombers pushed on toward Berlin. German fighters harassed them, attacked where they could, but the continuous escort presence disrupted the coordinated mass attacks that had been so devastating in 1943. Luftwaffe pilots found themselves fighting Mustangs instead of shooting bombers, and the Mustangs were hunting them aggressively, chasing them through clouds, following them down, refusing to let them disengage cleanly. By 1:00 p.m., the lead bomber formations reached Berlin. Flak erupted from the city's defenses. Thick black bursts at precise altitudes, shrapnel tearing through aluminum, hydraulic lines, flesh. The bombers held formation, opened bomb bay doors, ran their approaches despite the explosions surrounding them. Bombardiers hunched over northern bomb sites, making final adjustments, calling corrections. Steady, steady, bombs away, high explosives tumbled from thousands of aircraft, the city below government buildings, rail yards, residential district, erupted in smoke and fire, but for the crews releasing those bombs, the real shock wasn't what they were destroying. It was what they saw above and around them, American fighters over Berlin, engaging German interceptors directly above the Reichstag, above the Brandenburg Gate, above the heart of Nazi power. Silver Mustangs twisting and diving through flak bursts that should have driven them away but didn't. The impossible made visible. The Luftwaffe defenders over Berlin fought with desperation and disbelief warring inside their cockpits. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, a veteran pilot with GG-11, climbed through the flak over the city's southern approach, his Bf-1, 109 G6 straining for altitude. He'd intercepted American raids dozens of times, knew the rhythm of combat intimately. Find the bombers, coordinate with your squadron, hit them hard from the front, break away before the gunners track you, regroup, attack again. But today, Mustangs intercepted him before he could reach the bombers. Two P-51s dove from the sun, closing at terrible speed. Nock broke hard left, rolling inverted, diving away. The Mustangs followed. He pulled back on the stick, blood draining from his head as G. Forces crushed him into his seat, leveling out at 15-0, aero 0 feet. The Americans were still there, firing short bursts, walking rounds toward his aircraft. He firewalled the throttle, heading east toward cloud cover. The Mustangs matched his speed, exceeded it. One of them closed to 200 meters, cannon fire ripping past his canopy. Nock jinked right, left, desperate. His engine screamed. Coolant temperature redlined. He made the clouds, dove through, emerged at treetop level, racing for his airfield at Hastedt. The Mustangs didn't follow him down. They'd broken off to protect the bombers. But Nock's attack run was finished. He'd never fired a shot. This same scene replayed across the Berlin sky. Luftwaffe pilots attempted attack runs only to be bounced by Mustangs before they could position. Those who did reach the bombers found themselves fighting through escort screens, taking hits, losing wingmen, forced to disengage without pressing attacks home, and the escorts wouldn't leave. That was the nightmare realization spreading through German radio channels. Previous raids, the American fighters would vanish after their fuel ran low, forced west by mathematics and necessity. Now they circled over Berlin, engaged continuously, showed no signs of leaving. How much fuel did they have? Where were they going when this was over? The questions rattled German morale as much as the combat itself. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group in P-47 that had escorted the early leg, debriefed his pilots after landing back in England. They reported Mustang formations still over Brandenburg when the Thunderbolts turned for home. Those crazy bastards are going all the way. One pilot said, part admiration, part envy. Over Berlin, Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group spotted a lone Bf-1, 109 attempting to climb back into the bomber stream after an aborted attack. Gentile rolled his Mustang inverted, dropped behind the German fighter, closed to 300 yards and fired a 2-second burst. The 109's canopy shattered, the aircraft snapped, rolled right, fell away spinning. Gentile didn't watch it hit the ground. He was already scanning for the next threat, climbing back to altitude where the bombers droned onward through the flak. The Berlin flak was murderous 88mm guns firing proximity, fused shells, creating a ceiling of explosions that bombers had to fly through to reach their targets. B-17 shuddered with each nearby burst, shrapnel punching holes in wings and fuselages. Several bombers took direct hits, explosive shells detonating inside bomb bays or cockpits, aircraft disintegrating instantly, spreading debris across 3 miles of sky. But where flak was indiscriminate, the Mustangs were surgical. They dove on German fighters attempting to exploit the chaos of the flak zone, forced them to evade rather than attack, maintained a protective screen that saved dozens of bombers from being singled out and destroyed. Bomber crews, fighting their own battles against flak and cold and fear, glanced out their windows during the bomb runs and saw American fighters wheeling through the same deadly sky they occupied. It changed something fundamental. They weren't alone anymore. Someone was up here with them, fighting for them, refusing to abandon them. The bomb run completed, the formations turned west for the long flight home. This was traditionally the most dangerous phase. Damaged bombers straggling behind the formation, fuel running low, crews exhausted, German fighters pursuing for final kills as the Americans limped toward the channel. Not today. The Mustangs reformed around the bomber stream, positioned themselves between stragglers and pursuing German fighters. When Luftwaffe units tried to organize pursuit attacks, they found P-51s waiting, engaging them, forcing them defensive. German pilots, already low on fuel themselves after the intense combat over Berlin, couldn't press through determined fighter resistance. They broke off, headed for their own bases, landed with ammunition remaining but no will to continue the pursuit. The mathematics of air combat had reversed. For 2 years, distance had favored Germany. The Americans had to fly 600 miles to fight, then 600 miles home, every mile bleeding fuel and endurance. Now the Mustangs matched that endurance, and German pilots found themselves fighting at the limits of their own fuel, over their own territory, unable to disengage safely because American fighters would chase them home. By 4:30 p.m., the bomber formations crossed back over the English coast. 7 bombers had been lost, painful, but dramatically lower than the catastrophic losses of 1943. The Mustangs and Thunderbolts landed at their bases as light faded, pilots climbing from cockpits exhausted, faces creased from oxygen masks, hands still trembling from adrenaline. They'd done it. They'd escorted bombers to Berlin and brought them home. In Germany, Luftwaffe pilots landed at bases scattered across the Reich, many having diverted due to damage or fuel starvation. The debriefings were somber, the loss reports grim. 25 German fighters destroyed, dozens more damaged, several experienced pilots dead or missing. But the numbers weren't the worst part. The worst part was the realization settling over every pilot who'd flown that day. The Americans could do this again, tomorrow, next week, every clear day from now until the war ended. The sky over Germany no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. It belonged to whoever could stay there longest, and the Silver Mustangs had just proven they could stay forever. The impact of March 4 rippled through both air forces with the force of seismic shock, but it was only the beginning. March 6 brought another Berlin raid, 660 bombers, even heavier fighter escort. The Luftwaffe scrambled every available fighter, determined to prove the first raid was a fluke, that concentrated defensive effort could still stop the Americans. The result was the largest single-day air battle in history over Germany to that point. Over 1,000 aircraft engaged in swirling combat from the Dutch border to Berlin and back. The Mustangs were there again, silver contrails marking their presence from takeoff to landing. German pilots climbed into that sky knowing they would face continuous fighter opposition, and that knowledge degraded their effectiveness before a shot was fired. Hesitation crept into attack runs. Formations broke apart under pressure from Mustangs rather than pressing through to the bombers. 9 German fighters were destroyed that day, 11 American bombers lost, a loss rate of less than 2%. The mathematics were devastating for Germany. They were losing fighters faster than they could replace them. And worse, they were losing experienced pilots whose training and combat knowledge couldn't be replaced at all. Luftwaffe doctrine had always accepted fighter losses as tolerable because they fought over German territory. Pilots could bail out, recover, fly again, but the Mustangs changed that calculation. American fighters now hunted damaged German aircraft all the way to their bases, engaged them during landing approaches when they were most vulnerable, even strafed airfields after escorting bombers home. German pilots who survived being shot down faced injury, recovery time, gaps in operational readiness. The Luftwaffe's most valuable resource, experienced fighter pilots, was being attrited at an unsustainable rate. Worse was the psychological erosion. After March 6, Luftwaffe units knew that every mission against American bombers meant fighting through layers of escorts that wouldn't abandon their charges. The old tactical certainty was gone. Pilots began calculating survival odds differently, making subtle decisions, breaking off attacks earlier, avoiding prolonged engagement, choosing discretion over aggression. This wasn't cowardice. These were men who'd fought with extraordinary courage for years, who'd faced death repeatedly and continued flying. But morale is finite. Courage depletes when the mission feels impossible, when every sortie means facing superior numbers with no tactical advantage, when the strategic situation makes individual bravery irrelevant. In the ready rooms and operations centers across Germany, the mood darkened. Göring blamed his commanders. Commanders blamed intelligence failures. Everyone blamed the Americans' industrial capacity. How could you fight an enemy who produced fighters faster than you could shoot them down? But privately, in the conversations pilots had among themselves after the staff officers left, a different truth circulated. They were losing, not losing battles. They'd lost battles before, losing the war in the air. The Americans could reach anywhere in Germany now, bomb any target, escort themselves completely. The Luftwaffe could inflict casualties, resist, fight hard, but they couldn't stop it. The strategic bombing campaign, which had teetered on the edge of failure in late 1943, roared back to devastating effectiveness in March 1944. Target selection became aggressive against synthetic oil plants, aircraft factories, ball-bearing production, transportation hubs. The 8th Air Force flew deep penetration missions almost daily when weather permitted, and the Mustangs flew every one. German war production, which had actually increased throughout 1943 despite bombing, began to fracture under the sustained assault. Not immediately. Industrial infrastructure has inertia, redundancy, resilience. But the cumulative effect of losing aircraft factories, oil refineries, and transportation networks compounded week by week. By late March, Luftwaffe operational readiness reports showed alarming trends. Fighter groups that should have fielded 40 aircraft were launching with 25. Pilot replacement training was shortened to rush reinforcements to frontline units, men with 120 hours of flight time facing American pilots with 300+ hours and combat experience. The kill ratios reflected this imbalance brutally. Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger General of Fighters, met with Göring and pleaded for strategic changes. Concentrate the fighter force on defense, pull units back from other fronts, prioritize pilot training. Accept losses in ground attack missions to preserve fighters for bomber interception. Göring refused most of it. Hitler demanded offensive action, demanded fighters support ground forces in Italy and Russia, demanded visible resistance even when strategically futile. The Luftwaffe was being pulled in too many directions, diluting its effectiveness everywhere, but even unified focus couldn't have changed the fundamental equation anymore. The Mustang had rewritten the rules. As long as American bombers had fighter escort to Berlin and beyond, the Luftwaffe couldn't stop them without suffering catastrophic losses. And suffering catastrophic losses meant eventual collapse. The Americans understood this. 8th Air Force intelligence officers tracked German fighter losses, noted the declining resistance, observed the desperation in Luftwaffe tactics. They recommended increased pressure, more raids, deeper penetrations, attacks on Luftwaffe airfields themselves. The Berlin raids of early March established a new operational reality, and the Americans exploited it ruthlessly throughout the spring of 1944. By April, the 8th Air Force had transitioned from proving the Mustang's capability to weaponizing it systematically. Escort doctrine evolved beyond simple protection. Fighter groups received new orders, aggressive patrol, free hunting below 10,000 feet after escort duties completed, airfield strafing, attacks on ground transportation. The goal wasn't just protecting bombers anymore, it was achieving total air supremacy by destroying the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. The Mustang groups embraced this with lethal enthusiasm. Pilots like Colonel Zemk, Captain Gentile, Major George Preddy became household names in America, aces whose kill counts climbed into double digits, but their deadliest work wasn't individual dogfights. It was the systematic destruction of German air power on the ground. After escorting bombers to targets deep in Germany, Mustang formations would descend to treetop level on the return flight, hunting for German airfields. They'd strafe parked aircraft, fuel trucks, hangars, anything that supported Luftwaffe operations. Aircraft destroyed on the ground counted just as much as aerial victories, and they were safer to achieve. A parked W190 couldn't shoot back. German airfields became death traps. Luftwaffe pilots returning from missions faced the nightmare of American fighters circling their own bases, waiting for them to land when they were most vulnerable. Gear down, flaps extended, slow, defensive. Landing approaches that should have been safe became ambush zones. Pilots developed desperate tactics, landing at auxiliary strips, waiting for cloud cover, touching down with just enough fuel to taxi off the runway before flaming out. The psychological impact was crushing. Home base, the one place that should feel secure, became another combat zone. There was no respite, no safety, no moment when the war wasn't immediately lethal. By May 1944, Luftwaffe sortie rates over Germany had dropped by nearly 40% from their January peaks. This wasn't primarily due to aircraft shortages. German factories were still producing fighters in substantial numbers. The limiting factor was trained pilots and operational readiness. Units couldn't maintain combat effectiveness under constant attrition of both men and machines. The statistics told the story coldly. In the first quarter of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 10 fighter pilots killed or seriously wounded. Training schools couldn't produce replacements fast enough, and the replacements they did produce were inadequately prepared. A German fighter pilot arriving at a frontline unit in May 1944 had perhaps a 50% chance of surviving his first 5 combat missions. Meanwhile, American pilot training had matured into a ruthlessly efficient system. Pilots arrived in England with 300+ hours of flight time, advanced tactical training, gunnery school completion. They flew their first combat missions as wingmen to experienced pilots, learned gradually, survived their mistakes. The 8th Air Force could afford to bring pilots along slowly because they had depth. Losing one pilot didn't cripple a squadron. Germany couldn't afford that luxury anymore. New pilots were thrown into combat immediately, often with fatal results within days or weeks. The institutional knowledge that made air forces effective tactics, techniques, lessons learned through hard experience, was bleeding away with every pilot killed. The impact on German strategy extended beyond the Luftwaffe. The loss of air superiority meant Wehrmacht ground forces operated under constant threat of air attack. Troop movements had to happen at night. Supply convoys required dispersal and camouflage. Artillery positions faced immediate strikes if spotted from the air. The entire German military machine slowed, constrained by the absence of friendly air cover it had taken for granted in the war's early years. When the Allies invaded Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties over the invasion beaches. The Allied air forces flew over 14,000. German ground commanders screamed for air support that never came. The fighters were either destroyed, grounded by lack of fuel, or held back in futile defense of Germany itself. The Mustang hadn't won the war alone, but it had removed the one element that might have allowed Germany to prolong the conflict: the ability to contest control of its own airspace. With that gone, the strategic bombing campaign could proceed unimpeded, and the tactical air support for ground invasions could operate with overwhelming superiority. Hermann Göring, whose boasts about protecting German skies had once seemed credible, retreated from operational command. He couldn't face his pilots anymore, couldn't explain how the promises had turned to ashes. Galland and other senior commanders tried to salvage what they could, implementing desperate measures: jet fighter development acceleration, mass production of simplified aircraft designs, even proposals to ram bombers with expendable fighters. None of it mattered. The fundamental equation had changed on March 4, 1944, when silver Mustangs appeared over Berlin, and no amount of tactical innovation or desperate courage could reverse it. The Luftwaffe fought on through 1944 and into 1945, inflicting casualties, resisting with skill and determination. But they were fighting a losing battle against mathematics, industrial capacity, and the simple fact that the enemy could now reach them anywhere, anytime, and stay until the job was finished. By war's end, over 15-0 American heavy bombers had struck targets across Germany. The Mustang groups that escorted them claimed over 5-0 aerial victories and destroyed thousands more aircraft on the ground. The cost was high. Hundreds of pilots killed, thousands of airmen lost on both sides. But the strategic victory was absolute. Germany's industrial heartland lay in ruins, its transportation network shattered, its fuel production crippled, its air force a shadow of its former strength. The Mustang hadn't just escorted bombers. It had escorted the war itself to its inevitable conclusion, one mission at a time, all the way to Berlin and beyond. There's a photograph taken somewhere over Germany in the spring of 1944. A formation of B-17 stretches toward the horizon, their contrails bright against dark clouds, and above them, barely visible, a pair of Mustangs weave protective patterns through the sky. It's not a remarkable photograph technically. Thousands like it exist in archives. But it captures something profound about how wars are won. Not through single decisive battles, though those matter. Not through individual heroism, though courage is essential. Wars are won through the accumulation of small advantages, better logistics, smarter engineering, the willingness to solve problems relentlessly until solutions emerge. The Mustang over Berlin represented all of that. The P-51 wasn't magic. It was aluminum and rivets, an engine designed in Britain and built in America, fuel tanks made from paper and glue, assembled by workers who never saw combat but understood their work mattered. It was test pilots who pushed the aircraft to its limits and engineers who calculated fuel consumption curves and tacticians who realized range could be extended, and commanders who committed resources to an unproven concept. It was also the crews who flew those bombers, men who kept climbing into aircraft day after day despite terrible odds, who trusted that someone would solve the escort problem, who held formation when every instinct screamed to break and run. Their determination created the pressure that demanded innovation, and it was the German pilots who fought with skill and courage even as the strategic situation became hopeless. War strips away abstractions and leaves human beings facing each other across the sky. The men in the FW-190s and F-109s weren't villains from a propaganda poster. They were pilots doing what their country asked, fighting for survival, for their families below, for their comrades beside them. Their defeat was necessary for the war to end, but recognizing their humanity costs nothing. The moment when those first Mustangs appeared over Berlin wasn't just tactical. It was symbolic, proof that distance couldn't protect tyranny anymore, that industrial democracy could produce not just quantity but quality, that problems considered unsolvable could be overcome through persistence and ingenuity. 70 years of air warfare since then has refined the lesson. Range is freedom. Endurance is power. The force that can operate where the enemy cannot, that can sustain pressure beyond the enemy's ability to respond, wins. Every long-range strike fighter, every aerial refueling tanker, every persistent surveillance platform traces its conceptual lineage back to that silver Mustang escort mission in March 1944. But the deeper lesson is human. Technology doesn't win wars. People do. People who refuse to accept failure, who solve problems incrementally, who fight when afraid, who build when tired, who persist when the outcome is uncertain. The Mustang was important because it carried that human determination 600 miles into enemy territory and brought it home safely. The Germans were shocked when Allied fighter escorts arrived over Berlin. They shouldn't have been. They'd created a war that demanded total commitment from their enemies, and total commitment eventually finds a way. The shock was the sound of inevitability arriving at altitude, engines humming efficiently, drop tanks falling away, guns loaded. The shock was the sound of losing,